record. I shall share my screen. Oh, wrong one. Nearly got the wrong one. And then I'll set Ian away. That's brilliant. At the last presentation, Ian was showing us some thin slice analysis. Is that right? Where you slice the stone really thin. And I got very excited, and he promised that there will be more of that tonight. So I have brought popcorn for this. So up to you, Ian.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Kerry. Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see so many familiar faces again. And just in case there are some people out there who've arrived just for this particularly fascinating talk, my name's Ian Kille, and I'm the community geologist for the Hadrian's Wall Community Archaeology Project. And the particular reason for my being a part of this project is a thing called the Stone Sourcing and Dispersal Project, which pretty much does what it says on the can. It's about understanding where the stone from Hadrian's Wall came from, and where it has gone to afterwards, hence the title, Who Stole the Wall? And it's a project which I'm absolutely delighted and very excited to be a part of, but not only from the point of view of being able to explore a really rather interesting research project, which the Stone Sourcing and Dispersal Project represents in part of its aspect, but also being part of a wonderful team that is engaging with the great communities across the length of Hadrian's Wall in order to be able to do some citizen science to be able to help understand what's going on with the wall. And it is just such an amazing place to be, both in terms of its landscape, the archaeology, and also the geology has a lot of stories to tell. So a week or so ago, after the snow went away, I went out for my daily constitutional down towards Tynemouth. And I was quite surprised when I got there to find that Tynemouth Priory was actually open. So I took the opportunity to go in and have a wander around. It had been suggested to me by a friend of mine who posted some pictures a while back, that there were some really interesting features to see inside the Priory, and I was really not disappointed. And if I could have the first slide, please, Kerry. So one of the things that struck me in wandering around this rather amazing graveyard is just how familiar the cycle of birth, life and death is to us. And it's a cycle that defines us and our animal and plant cohabitees on this planet. And much of our thinking is marked out by our 80 years and 10, and by the graduations of that are linked to our cultural, developmental, and our political timescales. But sometimes we get these clues which take us into deeper time. And here in Tynemouth, these 200-year-old gravestones have been beautifully etched by the slow but persistent process of erosion. And this made me aware of the power that these incremental processes have when they're combined with lots of time. So what happens then if we open up our minds to the idea, not just of historical time, and I mean by that time which is measured in hundreds and sometimes thousands of years, start to talk about hundreds of thousands and indeed millions of years. And it raises the question about what can be achieved by these incremental processes driven by wind, water, ice, when you have epic amounts of time. So from a geologist's point of view, to understand the history and prehistory of the material aspects of Hadrian's Wall, to my mind, dwelling in this deep time is essential. So what I would like to do with this talk is to dwell in deep time. So to trace the life cycle of Hadrian's Wall from its geological foundation right the way through to its current state of decay and indeed its redistribution. So, as with any good story, the narrator needs a perspective. And I thought it would be interesting to take the point of view of one of the component minerals that make up the wall, sandstone. And the choice for this was kind of obvious. So what I didn't want was a character like that of Ned Stark in the wall featuring series of the Game of Thrones, who was killed off in the first series. What I needed was someone who's more of a Tyrion Lannister, as it were, who has a really gritty determination and seems to survive despite being knocked about rather a lot and being considerably moved about and transported all over the place. So the character, which is a major mineral component of the wall and which can be followed right the way through this story, is that of quartz. If I could have the next slide, please, Kerry. So what is quartz? Well, quartz is amazing. It's really beautiful. And here's some examples of some crystalline bits of quartz. So smoky quartz on the right, clear quartz in the middle, and some amethyst on the right. And yeah, quartz is a bit of a party animal in terms of its colours. And if I could have the next slide, please. It does really fancy. So here's some agates with some of the extraordinary colours and patterns that quartz can make in the natural world. And if we go to the next slide, please. Though it has to be said that quartz more often looks like this. So on the left, here we have some vein quartz up in the Borrowdale volcanics in the Lake District. And on the right, some of the typical types of quartz pebbles which you find on the beach. A rather matte, grey, white, yellowy sort of colour. The thing about quartz is that it is really hard. It's not quite up there with sapphire and diamond in terms of its hardness, but it's really not far off in terms of its ability to be really hard. Go to the next slide, please. And quartz is made of, from a chemical point of view, it's made from two elements, silicon and oxygen. Quartz is silicon dioxide. And one of the interesting things about silicon, I have here the periodic table of the elements, and those chemists among you will know that if you follow the columns in the periodic table, that the columns tend to have family affinities. So if you read up and down, things which are in the same column have some of the similar sorts of attributes. And if you could just give me the next animation, please, Kerry. And it just so happens that silicon and carbon are one above each other in the periodic table of the elements. If we go to the next slide, please. And we know that carbon is extraordinary in the diversity of the way in which it operates. So not only can you find it, if you like, in its raw form as just carbon in the shape of coal, but also, if we could have the next animation, please. Carbon also comes as diamond. But also when you mix carbon with a whole bunch of other elements, if we go to the next animation, please, it's capable of forming all sorts of amazing and complex molecules. And indeed, some of those molecules are things that form the very foundation of what we are made of. Now, silicon, if we could have the next slide, please, has a similar ability. It is able to, not only in its raw metallic form, but once it's mixed with other elements, it produces all sorts of fantastic and complex minerals. And just as an aside, John Scott, hello John, was complimenting one of the presentations earlier on for the number of terms in it, which he was going to go away and have to look up afterwards. So this slide is specially for you, John. So knock yourself out with all of these. Kerry, if you could just run through the next set of animations. So what we have here is olivine on the left, and then we have a feldspar, plagioclase feldspar, calcium-rich feldspar, and pyroxene, all of which are the sorts of minerals which you find within basaltic types of rocks. And then we've had alkali feldspar coming up, and beneath that, this wonderful, beautiful black piece of amphibole. And next up is Muscovite Mica. And these three, along with quartz, are the sorts of things which you find within granite. And indeed, there are other exotic silicates, and the remaining two on the right-hand side, which are tourmaline, or garnet at the bottom and tourmaline at the top. And there are many, many others. So there are zeolites and clay minerals, and indeed the evil cousin of the silicate family, asbestos. These are all silicates, and they're all important members of the what are known as the rock-forming minerals. So a very high percentage of the types of rocks you will find are made up of these silicate types of minerals. But it is quartz that is far and away the most durable of these minerals, both in its chemical and in its physical properties. So it's quartz that is the real survivor of this. So we have the next slide, please, Gary. Thanks. So as I was saying, granite is really the starting point for this journey, this life cycle that we're going to follow in order to understand a bit about the components of Hadrian's wall. And granite, if we could have the next animation, please. The first picture I showed you was of a piece of granite from Kille in just to the north of the Solway Firth. And that plays a part in some of the geological story of Hadrian's wall. And what you see if you zoom in on this granite, which is what this second animation is, you can see some of the mineral components in here. So the grey mineral that you can see, which forms quite a high percentage of this slide, is quartz. The white, bright white colour is feldspar, and the black coloured mineral is probably a mixture of amphibole and maybe a little bit of mica in there as well. Now the thing is that even when a granite is formed, I should probably explain, the granite is explained from a liquid magma, a magma which is obviously rich in silica and other alkaline elements, which then cools down and crystallizes to form this material. And granites are one of the most common igneous rocks that you find within continents. And I emphasize within continents because if we look across the whole of the planet, in fact, basalts are by far and away the most common igneous material, and that's because most of the ocean floor is composed of basalt. So what happens after a granite is formed and is starting to cool? If we could have the next slide, please, Kerry. So here we are, we've gone down to Cornwall. And Cornwall is particularly interesting from this point of view. Cornwall is the source of clay, and the sort of clay, high quality clay, which is used in making porcelain. And the reason why it's a really important source of clay is because the outside of the really large granite intrusions, which you find in Exmoor and Dartmoor, as the granite was cooling down, there was a major hydrothermal system which interacted with the outer layer of the granite. And that hydrothermal system, the heat and the particular chemical constituency of it, basically started to break down the granite in situ. The quartz was a survivor in this, but the feldspars in particular got broken down into kaolin and some of these other clay minerals, of which there are many. Clay minerals is an entire lecture all on its own. And it's this kaolin which forms this very fine clay material, which is used as a constituent in really good quality clays. And the old pits, which is where the kaolin used to be washed out of these massive great quarries using enormous hoses in order to wash them out, forming this amazing moonscape, has now been reclaimed as part of the Eden project. So that's the starting point. The granite starts to erode, to weather in situ. So what happens next? Let's have a look at the next slide. what is it that takes the quartz from things which look like things on the left-hand side to the next animation, please, Kerry, to something which is much more rounded and polished? Well, in this particular case, the journey was one which was done via a tumble polisher. However, the action of a tumble polisher is very much the sort of thing that happens in the natural environment too. So let's explore the various routes that might take the quartz crystals on the left outwards. So the Himalayas in Nepal is a place, a mountainous area, which contains an amount of sedimentary material, but also it contains a lot of granitic material where there's plenty of hard quartz-rich material, which is being eroded. And there are various routes from those mountain sources outwards. So the ice and glaciers on top of the mountains will crack open the granitic material and start breaking it down up there. And the combination of landslides and ice melting and ice movement will start to move that material away from the mountain and out into the, in this case, the massive river system that is the Ganges Delta, through the river systems, which is a sink for some of the quartz grains, and then out into the Bay of Bengal. And indeed, in the Bay of Bengal, there are large amounts of sand and clay and other clastic material which is deposited out in the sea there. But also the sea, the oceans, the way they work, they not only take in that broken down quartz material, but some of it also gets washed back. And any of you who maybe have been out to Whitley Bay recently will have seen that the really stormy weather that we've had during this snowy season has actually ripped off a lot of the sandy material from the surface of the beach there, leaving it almost bare of sand. But over the summer period, that sand will then come back onto the beach again. So here we have some of the major locations in which that sandy material, which is broken down from the mountains, is actually deposited within the fluvial, the river systems, but also within the sea, the deep sea, but also within the foreshore in which that material gets recycled into. With the next slide, please. And also, if we look in the other direction from the Himalayas, we can see that some of that material moves off sideways through the river system and into some of the lacustrine, the lake systems, which sit within the Tibetan side of the Himalayan landscape, and indeed get taken further off out into the Gobi Desert here, where sand goes into a massive Great Basin here, where very large amounts of sand are sunk within a desert landscape, where wind is the major force which is moving this material around rather than ice and water. Great, if we go to the next slide, please. So here is some of what this looks like on the journey through the landscape. So on the left, we have a landslide which has brought material down from the high peaks in the Himalayas, and you can see the angular, very mixed nature of the material which you have within this landslide. And if we have to look at the next animation, please. Also for the Himalayas, but this is material which has been transported through a combination of ice, but also water. And again, this fluvio-glacial material here has a whole mixture of different sizes of grains in it, from the very finest of clays right the way up to not quite such angular, but nonetheless still a bit rough around the edges, blocks of material. And if we go from the next slide, please, Kerry. And as the grains progress through the fluvial system, and this picture is from the grains within the Colorado River. And what you can see here is that the grains are progressively becoming less angular, more rounded, but still quite a mixture of all sorts of different types of mineral in here, as they're transported further and further away from the source. If we could have a look at the next animation, please, Gary. And these are the next two animations, this one on the next one, please, are beach sands. And what you can see here, as we've gone even further away from the source, and the quartz has been through more of the tumble polishing action that you have, both within the rivers and also within the action of the waves within the sea and the currents that you find in the sea. But those grains have been rounded even more, and the minerals other than quartz have been broken down physically and chemically, and you're left with a much purer mixture of quite rounded grains of quartz. If you go over to the next slide, please, Kerry. But just as an aside, the beach sand isn't necessarily made of the very resilient grains of quartz that sometimes, like on this beach in Jamaica, you can have sand which is made of this rather softer and less durable olivine. And the reason why you have this is in this particular location, the cliffs which are behind this beach are pretty much made of the olivine which is on the beach. So in this case, the material which makes up the sand comes from somewhere which is really very nearby. And it is this combination of the different types of process, how far away the material has traveled, how long it has been in the system for, which gives some of the diversity of the different types of sandstone that get preserved within the geological record. And it's this which allows us to distinguish different types of sandstone when we find them. So for example, if I could have the next slide, please. I talked about the Gobi Desert and the way that wind will actually redistribute sand grains and other minerals around within that desert environment. And what we have on the left is an example of a thing which goes by the name of a dry canter, a German name which means basically three faces. And it's one of the things that happens in desert environments. It produces these astonishing and rather beautiful, really sharp edges in the way in which stones in this case get eroded, but also the really quite fine grain mineral grains, including the quartz grains that you find in particles which make up desert material. And the other thing which you get is this thing called desert varnish, which is an example on the right-hand side, where stones and indeed the very fine grains which make up the sort of sands and sandstones which you get in desert environments have got this shiny iron patina on the surface of the grains, which means that when you find sandstones which have got grains which mean they have been formed in a desert environment, it means you can recognize them and you can distinguish them from other types of sandstone. So can I have the next slide, please, Gary? So along with these mineral types, mineral shapes, and the way in which those mineral grains have been sorted and tumbled, we can also pick up some information to help us understand what's going on in the sandstones from the sorts of patterns which you find on them. So here we've got a set of examples of different types of patterns that you might find in sandstones. So the first three of these are examples of cross-bedding. So the top two are a thing called planar cross-bedding, where you have these sets, as these coarse layers are called, which within them have these fine bandings, which are at this regular shallow angle going across it, which are brought about by ripples moving across the surface of the bed in which the sands are being laid down. So if you like, these patterns are the ghost of ripples from these ancient rivers, in this case preserved from some 350 million years ago on the Northumberland coast. And the one at the bottom is a similar sort of thing, but here we have trough cross-bedding, where small channels of sand are migrating across the the surface of a riverbed, and maybe in channel bars to produce these sorts of formations. And if we could have a look at the next set, please, Kerry. Here are some examples of the sorts of things which we find within the Hadrian's Wall area. So the top two pictures, Tom, at the top, you will recognise those who were in the presentation earlier on Walltown Crags. This is from a small outcrop very close to Walltown Crags with a really nice example of cross bedding. And below that, we have some parallel sets of bedding, very fine bedding, which is very distinctive and found in the quarry at Ladycross, which I hope we may be able to get out and go and visit sometime later in this year. And the bottom is an example of where sometimes you find on the surface of bedding planes within sandstones these beautifully preserved ripples, the actual ripples themselves in the surface of the sandstone. If we have to look at the last two, we have some slightly more exotic structures where the rate at which sand is deposited is so fast that the water within the sand accumulation gets trapped. And at some point, the whole of this system is out of equilibrium. There's water inside that sand. There's so much of it, it wants to get out, it wants to escape up to the surface. But there's more sediment being added the whole time. But sometimes due to, or maybe an earthquake or a heavy-footed amphibian crossing across the top of the surface, that unstable equilibrium is broken, and the water will find its way out into a mud volcano or something like that. And that water, as it escapes, will completely disrupt the patterns within the sedimentary to produce these extraordinary water escape structures, which are really distinctive and really useful in terms of categorizing the types of sandstones which you find. With the next slide, please, Kerry. I promised Kerry thin sections, and here they are. So the best way sometimes to really understand what's going on inside a rock is to look up really close and in person. And the best way of doing that is by cutting the rocks into very, very thin slices, and these are about 0.2 of a millimetre thick, so you can shine a light through them using a petrographic microscope, which gives you lots of useful information about exactly what types of grain you've got going on in there, where there aren't grains, and the way in which those grains are behaving. So what we've got here is the white bits in this are quartz grains, and as you can see, they're reasonably well rounded. The blue bits are actually holes. So the way in which we do this with thin sections is to impregnate the rock with resin, which has been stained with this obviously not mineral blue, and that helps us understand where there are holes, pore spaces within the rock. And there are some other things going on here as well. So if you look down towards the bottom of the slide, you'll see there is a squarish rectilinear grain of quartz just to the right of the really dark patch. And if you look very closely, you will see that there's a sort of shadow outline inside a slightly fainter outline outside of that, all of which is the same mineral, that they have the same crystalline structure. But that shadow line in the middle of that rectilinear structure is the original grain of quartz that was laid down at the time that the sandstone was being formed in a river in this case. And that after the sediment was laid down, water percolating through this pore structure that you can see in front of you crystallizes more quartz on the surface of this quartz grain. So you can see the original quartz grain is gradually growing into the spaces around the outside of it. And in fact, the dark browny colored material to the left of that grain is made of a mixture of iron and also calcium carbonate, calcite, which is also growing within these pore spaces. Now, this particular specimen comes from some work which I did with the Lindisfarne Peregrini project, and is actually part of one of the sandstones that was used to construct the medieval chapel on top of the Hoof on Lindisfarne. So it's quite an exotic piece of material. And there were two types of sandstone within that medieval chapel. This is part of the stuff that was used in order to construct the upright walls, and was quite a soft white sandstone. And if we look at the next slide, we can see something which looks quite different. And in this slide, Kerry's looking worried, which means that something's gone wrong with it. We got the next slide there, Kerry? Ah, here we go. Yes, excellent. Next slide is right. So this next slide, as you can see, is quite different. The amount of blue in this is greatly reduced. There are still blue patches there, but what has happened is that you've got a combination. There's a certain amount of brown, particularly if you look at the top left, you will see that there is some browny material in there, which is iron, probably a mixture of iron oxide and iron carbonate. And you can see that distributed around various places around the grains, particularly coating some of the grains. And also you've got this sort of rather fuzzy, grubby looking mass, which is actually calcite in this particular case. Now, this particular sandstone, and another interesting point is that the grains in this one are much more angular. So obviously there's been more growth in here, and this particular sandstone was one of the ones which was used for the construction of the massive foundation stones of the chapel, which are much harder, much stronger, much more durable. Part of the reason why that's the case is because the cement which is holding this sandstone together is much more developed, and therefore makes the sandstone much harder. And if we could have a look at the next slide, please, Kerry. Yay, Kerry's looking happy, so that's good. So, and this is a sandstone which was taken from a piece of work I did on the Willington Wagonway. And we took samples from various places around, and this is from a piece of sandstone which has got the wonderful name of the grindstone post, which gives a bit of a clue that this is actually a really, really hard sandstone, and absolutely it was. This was quite entertaining to try and break open in pieces and then try and cut up in order to make into a thin section. And as you can see, the white pieces in this, again, are quite angular pieces of quartz, but there's all sorts of other material in here as well. So you can see in the top middle of it, you've got a thin piece of material, which, yeah, that's great, thanks, Kerry, which is a piece of mica, and there's another piece just just nearby to the right of it, and also a flattish piece across to the left, almost brown. Keep going, up a bit, right a bit, down a bit, pale brown, sort of, yeah, you're there, that's the one. Fire, it's like, what's his name? Yeah, Huey Green, yes. That's another piece of mica, and you can see the almost hexagonal outline of the crystal in that particular one as well. But thank you, David. Yes, golden shot. That's the one. The rest of it is cement. It's stuff which is formed after the sandstone was sand for the sandstone was laid down, and the diagenetic cementation of this stone. And as you can see, there's no pore space here at all, and it's part of the reason why this is so hard. If we can have the next animation, please, Kerry. One of the clever things which you can do with a petrographic microscope is look at it under polarized light, which gives all sorts of fascinating information about the mineral types within, and gives yet more color and excitement in terms of what's going on within the slide. And that is just arriving, and it's fading in very beautifully and slowly. So I hope you can all see that. And one of the things which I wanted to point out in that is, if you look at the top right-hand side, about here on the slide, you will see that it's this sort of iridescent sort of thing with an outline around the outside of it. And what this matrix is made of is not just a mush of whole different series of small grains. It's actually made of really quite large crystals which wrap around the outside of the grains. So the cement itself is made of a whole series of interlocking grain crystals of calcite, which adds to the whole strength of the of this particular sandstone. So the reason for showing you these, and just to give you a sense of the scale of these, the mineral grains that we're looking at here, and indeed I should have said in all of these thin sections, each of the grains is about 1 millimeter across. So we're looking at really quite tiny things here. So the reason for showing you this is to give you a clue that there is a relationship between the quality of building materials and what they look like and the sorts of things which we can understand from the sandstones and the way in which they're formed by looking in detail inside those sandstones. Grand, if we could have a look at the next slide, please. This is one of the great things about bandwidth, is it comes and it goes. And it looks like Hadrian is having a bad moment for its bandwidth. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Kerry. I'm just going to take a brief pause because I printed myself off a picture of all my slides so that I could follow through them here whilst, just in case there was a delay on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get that so I can keep on talking to the slides whilst we're waiting for it to come up. So bear with me just a moment, folks. And actually, I'll tell you what I might also do, so whilst we're waiting, Kerry, is just to pick up one or two of the questions that have been asked on the chat as well. So I seem to have managed to get John going nicely on Google, so great, good stuff. Thanks, John. Yeah, David, yes, there will definitely be a test at the end, so yeah, keep making the notes. Although having said that, everything which I've said here, pretty much, you can find within the stone sourcing and dispersal guides which were written during lockdown. So if there's any terminology or explanation of a lot of this material, just go to the SSD guides, and there's everything you need there to refresh your mind or to pick up the information about it, and more. There's more in there than I'm talking about tonight. And yes, indeed, thin sections are beautiful, beautiful things. Yeah, I can well imagine that there is a scope for merchandising all of this. And in fact, I don't know if one of the things that I've been doing during lockdown is I've written a whole series of blogs. And the one which I wrote for Christmas, which was basically an excuse to have lots and lots of pretty pictures of agate. There's a colleague of mine out in Italy who goes under the name of @Microscopia, who's taken some absolutely fabulous images of all sorts of things. And some of the images which he's produced I used within that blog with his permission. And also he basically merchandises the whole lot. So yeah, thin sections. And in terms of the kit which is actually used in order to produce thin sections, it's actually relatively simple. That it uses a combination of a diamond saw in order to cut the rock into rectangles. One of the flat surfaces is then smoothed off and glued using epoxy resin to a glass slide, and then the top of that rectangle is cut or ground off down to a thickness of 0.2 of a millimeter, and then you have everything you need in order to be able to go with a thin section. So it's just a question of cutting and then grinding it. So it looks like we're back in slides. So I'm gonna start talking to that again. Could we go back one, please, Kerry? Thanks. Brilliant. So the last thing about categorizing stones I wanted to talk about was that in the way in which stones are cemented, sometimes the patterns which are formed, particularly when iron is involved in producing the cementation of those stones during diagenesis, produces some fabulous patterns. So on the left here, we have a piece of boulder from King Edward's Bay, just underneath the Tynemouth Priory, which has been eroded from the shelves of rock there. And on the right-hand side, you can see a beautiful eroded piece of stone, which is part of the Tynemouth Priory, which gives a really neat example of where it seems extremely likely that the source for the stone that was used to construct at least part of the Tynemouth Priory is exactly the same as the material on the beach just underneath. And it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if some of the quarrying that was done was just exactly there in order to produce Tynemouth Priory. So we've reached a point where our grain of quartz has travelled from its magmatic mountain home down through the rivers and into the deserts in order to create the set of sandstones which we can use as a source for building a wall with. So if we could have the next slide, please, Kerry, which is a map of the geology of the Hadrian's Wall district. And this is simply to say that there are a whole range of different types of sandstone at different age. So going from right to left, from east to west, in Newcastle upon Tyne, you will see that there are these grey and dark grey rocks, which are the most recent of the Carboniferous rocks, which form part of the Pennine Coal Group. And they consist of a mixture of shales, coals, and sandstones which are laid down in river channels. And then as we move further west, we go into these limey yellow-green rocks and the blue-coloured rocks. These are also Carboniferous, but older than the Pennine Coal measures, and these form part of the Yoredale group, which are a cyclic set of, again, a lot of sandstones, siltstones and shales and the occasional coal, but also a number of limestones as well. And then finally, we move across to the western part where we've got these pinky reddy rocks, which are Permian and Triassic in age. And these sandstones, some are formed in rivers, but some of them are formed under desert conditions as well. And as the colour on the map suggests, these are very distinctly reddened, being formed in a really hot desert type of environment, and are really distinctive and quite different from the set of Carboniferous sandstones which you find further in the central and eastern part of the district. So this is just simply to say there are a lot of different types of sandstones, and there are ways in which we can distinguish those. So let's have a look at the way in which the sandstones might have got onto the wall. So here we are back at Walltown Crags again. And I already alluded to this in the discussion we had earlier about Walltown Crags and what's going on there, and some of the things which you can see on the map. So if we have a look, if we could have the next animation, please, Kerry, that it may be, and that certainly logistically, as far as the Romans were concerned, that sourcing stone from quarries right next to the wall would make the amount of effort involved in making the wall really quite small. And it just so happens that at this particular location, we know from those workings brackets, disused closed bracket, just to the left of Walltown Crags, that there's some really good quality building material really handy to the wall. But it may be that in other locations, if we get a next animation, please, Kerry, that depending on which direction the wall is being built at that particular time, they've kind of got a road in place. So the road might have been another route by which you could bring good quality sandstone along the length of the wall relatively straightforwardly in order to then place it on the wall and build it. Go to the next slide, please. And there are other alternatives. So, for example, if we think about the area to the west, and this is particularly interesting in terms of construction of the wall. And as you will know, that originally it was a turf wall, and it was only later on that it was turned into a stone wall. And there are two things about the western part of the wall. One is that there is almost no remnant of the stone wall. Very little of it actually remains. And also the outcrop of stone, the access to the stone here is very, very limited. Almost the whole area is smothered in glacial rubbish. And it's very difficult to find or extract decent sandstone material. Now we know that, for example, at Kirkpatrick Fleming, the next animation, please, Kerry, just north of Gretna Green at the top here, that there is really good sandstone within the, which is still being used in the quarries up there, but also really visible within the stream sections there. So maybe, if we have a look at the next animation, it would be easier in this particular case, rather than taking it down the M6, to actually float it down one of the rivers, and then, next animation please, simply to boat it across the Solway Firth. So maybe this is another route by which the sandstone could be sourced and brought onto the wall. The next slide please. So the wall has been constructed. So what happens next? So even in a place like this at Steel Rig, and particularly after it's been so wonderfully reconstructed by Jane and her team, there's an awful lot of the wall which ain't there. There's more than double the height of the wall here, which has gone somewhere else. And if we look at the next slide, please. And there are other places where there's really not very much wall at all. So who did steal the wall? And I don't know about you, but these sheep look really pretty guilty to me. And there's an awful lot of sheep there. And I know they're pretty stupid animals, but I think this is just pretense. And when you think, you know, that sheep are capable of forming a formation team on the back of a motorcycle, I'm absolutely certain they're quite capable of shifting material around under the cover of dark. But other than the sheep, if we could have the next slide, please, Kerry. There are other obvious ways in which the stone from the wall gets removed. So here at Walltown Crags, there's obviously some very smug quarry owner who has ripped out a large chunk of wall here. What exactly that particular quarryman did with the stone, I think, will probably remain a mystery. But as a quarryman, he probably valued the stone that was actually taken off from this vast bite out of the wall. The other obvious way in which stone actually disappears, if we could look at the next slide, please. And thank you to Andrew Curtis of Heddon for this next particular picture. That some of the wall has actually been removed and tarmacked over for the length of the military road. And indeed, in the urban environment of both Carlisle and more particularly in Newcastle going out to Wallsend, a lot of the material there has been removed and buried under the urban landscape. But other options are available. So if we could have a look at the next slide, please. I'm really enjoying the chat at the moment. That stone is a valuable resource, and landowners were really quite happy to have some of this stuff on their land. And it's great for military applications. So here at Thirlwall Castle, vast amounts of stone have been reused. And if we could have the next animation, we've already had our wonderful volunteers busily measuring and looking in detail at the stones which you see in Thirlwall Castle. And I hope that we're going to have a lot more time to explore this castle, to understand in a more quantitative way how much and of what sort of stone is needed in order to build a castle, and therefore to understand how much wall you need to use up in order to build a castle like Thirlwall. And there are other military places along the wall. So, for example, the next animation. So this is the Peel Tower in Corbridge, and another defensive building, which we'd like to spend some time looking at. And the owner of the Peel Tower is happy for us to do that as well, which is great. But not only military applications, but also the ecclesiastical mob got involved in the stone robbing as well. So here in Corbridge, there's this wonderful Roman arch inside the church. And if we could have the next look at the next one, please. Lanercost Priory also has a lot of material in it, which has probably been removed from the Roman wall. And interestingly, some of the material in this, and if we could have the next animation, please. This is the beautiful medieval church, old church just outside Brampton, that preserved in Lanercost, and this church is some of the only bits of Roman stone which have been sourced from the Permian and Triassic sandstones. So they are of particular interest in terms of not only understanding where the stone has gone to, but what the Roman wall was actually like before that material was removed. And if we could have the next slide, please. And one of the other intermediate houses, this is Drumborough Castle, which is a fabulous place. And it's kind of a hybrid military installation and farmhouse vernacular building, but rather wonderful, which also has been remade out of what is probably a lot of Roman material, which you can have the next animation, please, Kerry. We can see part of the WallCAP in one of the lockdown partial liftings we managed to go and get a look at. That looks like a shed load of Roman wool to me, and the WallCAP team getting quite excited by it all, even despite the vast amount of rain that was falling on us at that particular moment. And indeed, this particular installation also made off with the next animation, which is an altar stone. So there are plenty of potential culprits for what's going on by way of removing stone from the wall. And just to finish off with, I just wanted to add that there are a whole pile of other possible places to which the wall might have been removed to. So go to the next slide, please. At one extreme, there are vernacular buildings such as farmhouses, cottages, in which there may well be Roman material. And indeed, here at Plane Trees, it may be that some of the dry stone walls may or may not contain Roman material. And this is one of the reasons why it's such an important thing to be able to work with communities across the whole length of Hadrian's Wall, and where you are so important in being able to make this project work. Now, I understand a little bit about the geology, and that what I want to do as part of this project is to make the geology and the landscape and the mechanisms by which it's formed and the material which these rocks are made of accessible to you all. But in order to be able to get at the archaeology, and in particular where some of that archaeology resides, it sits within the communities across the whole length of the wall. And this is why this project, and indeed the ability to be able to record that information through the fantastic app, which Catherine was showing us earlier on, is something which makes this project so exciting. There is one remaining culprit that we need to talk about, and if we could have the next slide, please. Which is that slow, persistent geological process that I talked about earlier. And go to the next animation, please. So here in Lanercost, and also at Tynemouth Priory, we can see, even in the relatively small number of centuries that these particular institutions have been around for, that geological processes is having its effect on these buildings. And if we go from look at the next slide, please. And it is interesting that the Romans seem to be really good at choosing their materials, and that the sandstones which they chose are fantastically durable. And in fact, they seem to be better at choosing their materials than either of the medieval monasteries did. And it may be that the medieval monasteries were more interested in the ability to be able to shape those stones than they were about the durability of them. But particularly in the central and eastern section of the wall, where really good quality sandstones were available, for the Roman wall is still in jolly good nick. But nonetheless, when you start thinking in geological time, that the ultimate fate of all of the Roman material will be that it will be returned to sand grains and go back into the geological cycle, and at some stage be uplifted into mountains and turned back into granite again. So we come back to the final slide, which takes us back to this thought about the life cycle and the parallels it has with our own human life cycle, and that the effect that life has on us and our ability to conceive timescales, and indeed to be able to think in the extraordinary and deep abstract time of that geology allows us to think about, and think maybe a little bit beyond our own political and indeed our own lifetimes, to think about and use the past in order to be able to understand what's going on now and what might indeed come up in the future as well. So with that thought, I'm going to say thank you very much indeed for staying with all these large numbers of words. If you've got any questions, more than happy to try and answer them if we've got enough time left. So thank you.